Hi everybody, welcome back. We are at the 12th century. My name is Simon. We're going to talk about historical events that are not directly related to the Jewish religion, but are very directly related to the Jewish people. I'll try and stay with the interesting stuff, the most significant events. I've also been listening to a great YouTube history teacher called Sam Aronov. You should check him out. We're going to start with a summary of the First Crusade. Although considered successful, the First Crusade was a disaster for European Jewish community. It also sabered the Jewish communities in Jerusalem, Haifa, and most of what is known as the Holy Land. After the unfortunate outcome of the First Crusade, where I remind you over 5,000 Jews were killed in Western Europe, a new form of papal bulls was introduced. They were introduced to protect Jews. The bulls forbade Christians on pain of excommunication from forcing Jews to convert, harming them, taking their property, disturbing the celebration of their festivals, and interfering with their cemeteries. I can't think of a single person who took any notice of those bulls. Nevertheless, they were produced. Despite efforts by various popes, violence against the European Jewish communities continued throughout the 12th century. In North Africa and Andalusia, a fanatic Muslim regime took over. Like Al-Qaeda, Jews as well as Christians were forced to convert. During the various crusades, many of the communities were stormed by locals and coerced into conversion and sometimes just killed. Let's talk about England. I've always liked England. England in the first part of the 12th century was under a period of anarchy and civil war. At Norwich, at 1144, was the first known blood libel. It had spread over the death of a 12-year-old boy called by the unimaginative name William of Norwich. Now, the small Jewish community lived next to the Norwich Castle and were under the protection of the newly established Anglo-Norman nobility, and they spoke French. William's family were of the Anglo-Saxons, and they spoke English. It was 80 years after the Norman conquest. There still had been issues of we and they. Jews were definitely part of the they. This led to an incited mob attack on the small Jewish quarter. Recently, while excavating for the Chapperfield shopping centre, 17 bodies were found down a medieval well. DNA tests show that they had been part of this massacre. Again, I'm always skeptic when I hear stuff like that. It's probably true, but I haven't checked it. Let's stay in England. 45 years later, at the coronation of King Richard, another massacre took place, and hundreds of the London Jewish community members were killed. And a few years later, again in York, a mob destroyed the community. It is fair to say that in some of those pogroms, it were the authorities and the church who tried to protect the Jewish community. Perhaps they tried. During the Second Crusade, which was at 1146, it was apparent that the Jews were not meant to be killed and coerced into Catholicism. I will describe what went on in a little more detail. The Second Crusade, at 1146, was called by the Pope as a result of the fall of the Crusader kingdom of Edessa to the Seljuks. In return for going on crusade, the knights and soldiers were promised indolation, loot, and a meaningful existence, and all they had to do was fight the non-Catholics. While preparation for the Second Crusade were taking place, the Pope came in person to France to make sure that the right kind of people and money was secured. His method included a great deal of preaching. The need for money and the incitement against the non-Catholic led to attacks on Jewish communities. I remind you that those communities acted as a bank then. They loaned money for the Crusader knights to equip themselves for the campaign. So a financial incentive was introduced, as well as religious frenzy. Those years in Europe, Bernard of Clairvaux, an abbot and mystic, was considered a spiritual leader of the Catholic world. Eventually, he formed the Cistercian order. While this was going on, a fanatic French monk named Randolph was instigating massacres of Jews in the Rhinelands. Bernard those years was very influential. He was asked to stop the massacre. Bernard traveled from Flanders all the way to Germany to deal with Randulf in person. As a result of his intervention, some Jewish communities were left untouched. Other communities paid a crusade tax and were able to continue, and some communities were less fortunate. I am working very hard to refrain from judging people at the time. The human heart is home both to good and evil. At times of stress, evil breaks out like a rash. The offer to convert to Catholicism was often followed by threats of death, and sometimes the mobs were in a hurry to move on and reduce the time allowed for contemplating their kind offer. And consequently, death was everywhere, and many communities never recovered. Nevertheless, it is sometimes assumed that authorities turned a blind eye. This should not be thought. No one wants riots. They can backfire. Many times authorities were unable to provide protection to the Jewish communities. And yes, sometimes they just didn't. The Second Crusade was not successful in the annexation of more territory in the Holy Land, but it was still a lot of fun, and it was still a joint European effort, and it strengthened the Kingdom of Jerusalem and Transjordan. On the Second Crusade went the young French monarch Louis and his lovely bride Eleanor, of whom he soon parted with. Here we are introduced to a queen among women, a formidable and ever so powerful Eleanor of Aquitaine, mother of no less than 10 children, future wife to no less than Henry II of England, and known for her son Richard the Lionheart. Preparation for the Third Crusade took place as soon as July 1187, after the disastrous outcome of the Battle of the Horns of Chittim. The defeat of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to Saladin was a blow to Europe. Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, Richard the Lionheart of England, and Philip II of France set out for a Third Crusade. Barbarossa was by far the most significant ruler of this period. He took extra care to reduce the violence against the Jews in the Holy Roman Empire. I would like to give a little talk about Frederick Barbarossa because he did something few others did. Although I haven't checked whether all of this is true, but I suspect some of it is true. In Germany, they had something called a Diet, which was a formal deliberative assembly where everybody talked and met to decide policies. For example, the Diet of Worms. Now, the Diet of Mainz was scheduled for March 1188. According to Rabbi Moshe HaKohen of Mainz, in a letter to his brother-in-law Eliezer of Worms, a mob gathered in the marketplace intending to invade the Jewish quarter on 26th of March, on the Sabbath of all things, and it was dispersed by the imperial marshal on orders of Frederick Barbarossa. The rabbi then met with the emperor, and who issued an edict protecting the Jews. Now, this business about the meeting I am a little suspect of, but the edict has been recorded. Later, in Strasbourg, Frederick had imposed a small tax on the Jews. That is a matter of record, to fund the crusade. Sadly, Barbarossa never made it to his final battle. He died while crossing the Salaf River in southern Turkey, on his way to the Holy Land. I enclose a photo of the river and the castle next to it. Barbarossa is considered one of the noblest leaders Europe had known. I feel it's time to properly introduce Saladin al-Ayyubi, considered by some to be the hero of the Third Crusade, except he was on the opposite side of the Crusaders. Saladin al-Ayyubi was a Kurdish general active in the Seljuk army. About 20 years before the Third Crusade, he took over from the Seljuks and became Sultan of Egypt and Syria. So Saladin was the kind of man every mother would want for her daughter, or for herself. A gentleman, wise, fair, just, formidable in battle, calculated politically. He was the kind of man to send his personal doctor over to the Crusader camp to treat King Richard. He and Richard were able to agree on several things, among which a peace treaty, the Jaffa Accord. This accord was the foundation of the Second Kingdom of Jerusalem that was centered along the coast in Acre. Hopefully we can talk about it in the next chapter. Around the end of the 12th century, Acre became a small center for Ashkenazi Jews. Not many, maybe one synagogue. Nevertheless, a significant magnet for West European rabbis of the group known as the Baalei Tosafot. Let's take a break now. We've covered the first three crusades. We met Barbarossa, we met Eleanor, Richard's mum, and Richard, and Saladin. We talked about the first blood label in Norwich. We talked about several massacres, too many in fact, in Europe. And the Jewish people lived on and kept arguing to no end. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe so that you can keep up.